Yo, welcome back to the Stop the Violence podcast. I am Alicia, the host of this, and today is another episode. Thank you for being here, whether you are a vegan, a non-vegan, or a hater from my past who's stalking me. You're welcome. You're welcome to listen. I love having you here. So let's get into it. Today's episode is going to be about the human rights of slaughter workers, something that not a lot of people ever talk about, and certainly a topic I didn't hear until I was vegan. Well, it turns out that killing animals all day, for hours, for days in a row, for months, for years, can start to negatively affect you. I know, shocking, right? I'm going to get into the topic of the fact that immigrants are often exploited for slaughter work, the fact that they end up with PTSD, they have increased risks of domestic violence when they get home, they have increased risk of suicide, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and alcoholism. And yeah, I'm also going to use mostly non-vegan resources, so there's no way that you can tell me that this is all vegan lies or vegan propaganda. I'm going to be looking at resources that are completely not related to veganism. So let's get on started. So according to the OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, slaughter work results in 17 severe injuries per month in U.S. slaughterhouses. Also say that approximately 2 slaughter workers have a limb cut off by slaughter machinery every week. The OSHA says that slaughterhouse workers are 3 times more likely to sustain an injury than the average American worker. It is obviously a very physically demanding and dangerous job, just from a physical injury standpoint, not even looking at the psychological effects. Because of such a high demand of meat, these workers are forced to work really fast, and we'll get more into that later, and they're using sharp tools. They have to cut fucking throats. You think that those same tools cannot cut human limbs? Of course they can. So of course accidents are bound to happen. So now we're going to get just into a report by the Midwest Coalition for Human Rights, so not a vegan group, a human rights group, and this report came out in October of 2012. So here is just a quote from that report. Meatpacking continues to be one of the most dangerous jobs in America. Working with sharp knives and other tools along a rapidly moving production line, workers often suffer from serious cuts and crippling repetitive motion injuries, such as severe carpal tunnel and tendinitis, that can permanently impair the use of their hands, arms, and shoulders. It also says that workers report facing discrimination and abuse from supervisors, which is not a surprise. If you're in an animal abusing and killing industry, it's not very likely that your bosses and managers are going to be very nice to you as the human worker. And another thing is that the workers also describe in this report being exposed on a regular basis to dangerous chemicals on the factory floor, which is also no surprise. They have to use a lot of dangerous chemicals in slaughterhouses and meat rendering plants and all of that. Horrible stuff. The report says that in meatpacking work, workers labor in confined spaces, work long hours without sufficient breaks, generally receive inadequate training to use equipment, and perform dangerous tasks. Workers also deal with loud noises, use sharp tools, and must lift and carry heavy carcasses on slippery floors. Okay, so this is a statistic from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2007, and they say that it has gotten better since then, but it says that the 12.1 incidence rate of injured workers per 100 full-time workers in the meatpacking industry in 2007 was more than twice the national average for manufacturing jobs. And then this next paragraph, I'm sorry, but I just have to read the whole thing to you because it's very telling. In spite of these well-documented hazards, the underreporting of injury and illness remains a chronic problem. Deteriorating conditions in meat and poultry plants have coincided with, but were not caused by, the reemergence of predominantly immigrant workforce. Unlike the early 20th century, immigrants in the contemporary meatpacking industry are largely from Latin America, although others are from Africa and Southeast Asia. Workers, many of whom are English language learners, fear retaliation and are reluctant to complain or report injuries. Many fear losing their job, and undocumented workers have additional pressures not to speak out. Research in meatpacking plants indicates that power disparities on the line deeply divide workers and supervisors. Supervisors have been known to use abusive language towards workers, creating an environment where workers can more easily be denied their legal, political, and civil rights, and leaving them particularly vulnerable to exploitation. I know from my personal experiences of the slaughterhouses that I have visited, I have seen pretty much only workers that are of color and are immigrants and speak another language and all of that. And there's definitely people working there that are aggressive. They have taken out their aggression toward us, and so it can only just make sense that they are receiving different kinds of verbal abuse and control tactics and just wrongful, unjust, probably illegal treatment of their superiors in this industry. Another thing too, not to put my own personal experience into it too much, but when I used to be involved with the horse industry, as I used to be a horse rider and all of that, when I worked on a horse breeding farm, I was treated in verbally abusive ways. I was treated in similar ways to this, so it's just rampant in these industries that exploit and abuse animals. They're 100% also exploiting and abusing the human workers that work for them. It just goes together, So the report goes on to say that many workers in slaughter and also meat packing, where it's just the people that are kind of cutting up and processing the murdered animals, they complain about not having adequate access to first aid kits, and they also say that they are discouraged from seeking medical care or a doctor, like actively discouraged if they complain. It says that these places are also not very well prepared, or not always well prepared for accidents involving chemicals should they occur. I'm going to read another very telling excerpt. Supervisors play an important role in the fast-paced environment of meat packing and processing plants and have a disproportionate amount of power in relation to workers. Participants described how supervisors closely monitor break times and sometimes increase the line speed for allowing bathroom breaks. Focus group participants consistently complained about not having enough time to eat lunch or go to the bathroom during the workday. Workers also reported feeling intimidated and, in some cases, poorly treated by their supervisors. This abuse was often based on race, ethnicity, and immigration status. Undocumented immigrants were insulted and signaled out for the worst jobs because they were unlikely to complain. Oh, it is so fucked up. So here's a quote from a pork worker in Minnesota. "We can barely grab the pieces and have to work in reduced spaces. We have to watch out not to be cut." And then a quote from a worker in Iowa says, "We are all packed into a small space. There's not enough space. We are shoulder to shoulder. There's no room to move. Some cut in one direction, others in the other. The chances to harm a coworker are high, and some areas where the workers are too close to each other." Can we talk about social distancing for a second? Because when this whole pandemic hit, we had to apparently keep slaughterhouses open to feed America, right? Even though we could just feed them plants. We already grow more than enough food for that, but whatever. Apparently, these places had to be open during a pandemic. Tell me how the fuck you could actually appropriately follow social distancing when things are like this. You can't. You simply cannot. Not to mention that meat causes pandemics. The report says that exposure to chemicals not only harms the respiratory system, but can also lead to burns. They also say that safety equipment to protect the workers from these chemicals is not always provided. A quote from a worker in Minnesota says, "I passed out. I was watching the band where the turkeys are killed with gas. I don't know too much about it or if it is related to the gas, but if you are cleaning that band and get splashed with that water, it harms you." Slaughter workers are also frequently exposed to infected tissues, blood, and other substances from dead animals. It says, workers occasionally perform their tasks while standing in a pool of blood. And you know that's true if you've ever watched Dominion or really any slaughterhouse videos ever. They also become soaking wet from fluids, often continuing to work their entire shift with dirty and bloody clothes. That's disgusting, and honestly, guys, if you are still paying for animal products, the blood might physically be on these workers, but that blood is on your hands because you're demanding it. So, something to think about. Not only are you killing animals, but you're causing these people all this suffering. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, though. Here's a quote from a worker in Minnesota. "Every day the same thing. At the end of the day, I have to wash myself to get rid of the blood and dirt I have over my body. It is not pleasant." And here's something that this report does not get into, that's related to just exposure to poultry. And you know what? I'll let Dr. Greger tell you.
From liver and pancreatic cancers. They found that those who slaughter chickens have about 9 times the odds of both pancreatic cancer and liver cancer. Just to put that in context, the most carefully studied risk factor for pancreatic cancer, one of our deadliest cancers, is cigarette smoking. Even if you smoke for more than 50 years, though, you only about double your odds of pancreatic cancer. Those that slaughter poultry appear to have nearly 9 times the odds. For liver cancer, it's more alcohol. Those that consume more than 4 drinks a day have triple the odds of lung cancer, whereas poultry slaughtering appears to increase one's odds 9-fold.
Yes, and that is just literally being exposed to poultry slaughter in general. Like breathing the air and the viruses and all of that shit. So that's not even getting into the chemicals or any of that. And what you just heard was Dr. Michael Greger, and he has a nonprofit website called nutritionfacts.org. I just played a little clip from that. I hope I'm allowed to do that. I feel like it'll be okay. But yeah, that is a really good resource for all of your nutrition information and more. It's all based on scientific peer-reviewed evidence. It's legit. It's not just vegans spewing nonsense. It's hard evidence. So that is a great resource to go to. And again, back to the report, we know that there are a lot of undocumented immigrants. They make up a large body of the slaughter and meat packing workers. And here's a quote from one of them in Minnesota. "Many of us are working without documents and they know. If we complain, the supervisors take us to the office. That is why we do not complain." So it's just like this whole silence thing, and I can't even imagine being in that position. I mean, nobody wants to work these jobs. There are like a few people who are kind of weird in the head who like want this kind of job and enjoy it, but a vast majority of people are doing it because they feel like they have like no other way, and a lot of the times that's why immigrants end up in these jobs, because they feel like they have no other choice. And I definitely have like compassion for that. So a worker in Iowa said, "We have to keep working in silence and not say anything because we need the job." Exactly, just kind of reiterating these ideas. And a poultry worker in Iowa says, "My coworker badly harmed her wrist. Her knife was dull, her hand got inflamed. She didn't say anything because she wanted to keep her job." So yeah, I mean, it is that bad that if you even complain once or ask to go to the bathroom or say, "Hey, I got injured," like you could actually lose your job. That's how bad it is. So I'm going to wrap up looking at this particular report with 2 final quotes. So a worker in Minnesota said, "They treat us, Latino undocumented, different and privilege others because we cannot freely denounce them." And that's illegal, but they're getting away with it because it's animal agriculture, big ag. It's, like, it just seems like anything flies, whether it's animal cruelty or human cruelty. And a worker in Iowa says, "Once they didn't pay me all the hours I work. I was mad and complained. I told them I worked more hours, and my supervisor said, 'Next week you are going to get the difference.' Then nothing happened. On the contrary, they took more hours away from my paycheck and never got the right salary." Hold up, I just saw one more thing. So it says, "Increased productivity in meat and poultry plants have not led to safer food." You don't say. Could it be the fact that, they've caused a fucking global pandemic? In fact, quite the opposite. In recent years, U.S. consumers have seen hundreds of thousands of pounds of meat producers recalled due to contamination by E. coli. People across the country, but especially those most vulnerable, like children and elderly, have become severely ill or in rare cases have died after becoming in contact with contaminated foods. Okay, so that's not even like workers, that's just people eating it. You have risk of pandemics and viruses and shitting yourself and deadly illnesses. It's just all so unnecessary. Just stop killing these animals. Just stop. It's so simple. Before we get into the next resource, I just want to say something in case it doesn't come up at any point in this episode, but there's also racism and discrimination of people that are more impoverished when it comes to just where they decide to place live markets and slaughterhouses and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking about this again just like the other day because I recently moved to Whippany, New Jersey, and I was in Haledon, New Jersey before, which is in walking distance to Paterson, New Jersey, which is a really rough area. And when I was here in this new place that I'm living, I Googled slaughterhouse near me because I was like, is there any place that I could protest or start a vigil at that's close to me? And every place that was coming up was in Paterson, New Jersey, and they have actually the largest halal slaughterhouse in the US there. And it's absolutely disgusting. And just a side note, activists that I know have wanted to start a vigil there, but they have not mostly because the area is not very safe to be standing around the streets, and if you've been there you would know what I mean. But the point I'm making is that they put these slaughterhouses not in nice, rich white neighborhoods, not even in like middle class neighborhoods. They put them like where the projects are. They put them where the people of color are. And it's really fucked up because it also contaminates the water. And people that live near slaughterhouses have higher risks and rates, actually, of cancers and different diseases because of this. So, I don't know what the term I'm looking for is. I don't know if that's known as socioeconomic racism, but there's definitely something going on. And that's also another topic for another day. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. There's a lot of human rights things that are intertwined with animal rights. So now I'm looking at an October 2019 article on this website called Grub Street about factory farming, and the reason I'm looking at it is because it mentions the Human Rights Watch and the reports that it has done on slaughter work. So here's a quote. "The people who actually process the animals that provide America's supply of pork, beef, and chicken, keeping up with the country's demand for affordable meat, is more dangerous than ever. And the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, which is the federal agency that enforces health and safety-related labor laws, currently operates, quote, with the fewest safety and health inspections in its 48-year history, according to a report from the Human Rights Watch," which again, the OSHA and the Human Rights Watch are not vegan groups, and this is also not a vegan article. And another quote. "Pretty much every other day, a worker is sent to the hospital or loses a body part," says Matt McConnell, a research fellow at Human Rights Watch. "On top of that, there are thousands of plant workers suffering chronic health issues, respiratory diseases brought on by the chemicals used to spray chickens, as well as crippling nerve and muscle pain that's caused by repetitive, relentless motion." And here's a quote that really echoes the last report I was talking about. Remember, that was made in 2012 and this is newer, but it still echoes the same thing that's going on. More than 60% of the workers McConnell interviewed for the report are immigrants, he says, some undocumented. While they're still entitled to workplace protections under international human rights law, they're afraid to speak up, especially in light of ICE raids across poultry plants in Mississippi. Immigration enforcement actions under the Trump administration have made workers feel less safe. And yeah, the president certainly has not helped with that issue. So now I'm looking at a report by SPLC, or Southern Poverty Law Center, that talks more about the conditions and injuries and things that slaughter workers and meatpacking workers are going through. So definitely a reoccurring theme that the workers are always complaining about is the line speed, the speed at which they're expected to use these incredibly dangerous tools. And, how do you think the U.S. Department of Agriculture responds to these complaints? They don't respond well at all. All they want to do is enact new regulation that just allows the line speed to increase. And here they're talking about the speed of processing birds, and they want to increase it from 140 birds per minute to 175, just to give you an idea. Can you even imagine, how fast that is? So they talked to a worker named Oscar, and this quote says, "As bird carcasses sped by him on the line, Oscar had to grab the wings and twist them into the position the company wanted, folding fast enough to meet a quota of approximately 40 chicken wings per minute, or roughly 18,000 wings per day. I did my job well," he said, "but little did I know I was harming myself in the process. They don't warn you that this can happen." And then later he gets tendonitis and carpal tunnel syndrome, and then they fired him. And he says, "They don't tell you the part that if you become sick, they'll fire you from the job." And they're saying that this kind of story is extremely common. And this worker was at a poultry plant in Alabama. And the report says 72% of the participants in this survey of 302 current and former poultry workers in Alabama described suffering a significant work-related injury or illness while working in the industry. So again, at risk of sounding repetitive because it's the same in all of these different places, they're talking about, excuse my computer's noise just now, but they're talking about the cuts and gashes that are happening all the time. And here's a couple of quotes. So this survey found that 17% of workers performing deboning, cutting, and trimming jobs had suffered a cut serious enough to require some medical attention. Company nurses often just gave the workers Band-Aids for lacerations and sent them back to the processing line. One worker said that after such an experience, the quote, chicken water that is on the bird carcasses and found throughout the processing plants, would get into his bandage, keeping his cuts wet and eventually dislodging his bandage as he worked. His cuts became infected and continued to bleed weeks after his initial injury. Isn't that nice? I mean, that's also where pandemics come from. If you think that there's anything clean about any of these jobs throughout the whole process of animal agriculture, you could not be more wrong. I mean, I have been to vigils and these animals show up in piles, several inches of their urine and diarrhea. And that's, I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but this is where pandemics come from, people. I mean, if you don't like 2020, how things have changed, how lives have drastically changed, maybe you should not continue to support the cause of it. I mean, assuming that what we are told is true, this pandemic was caused by a wet market, and we have wet markets here in the US. We have live markets in New York City, of all places. So it's not like it's just other countries. The meat that you could be buying could be making the next pandemic. You have bird flu, you have swine flu, mad cow, SARS, MERS. But that's a tangent. So the stats that I've mentioned might also be an underestimate. And here's a quote to explain that. So they say, it's difficult to determine the real number of injuries in the poultry industry, and I would assume the other industries as well, because data compiled by the OSHA often underreports the frequency and severity of injuries and illnesses in all workplaces. And that would make sense with so many of these workers too scared and intimidated to report to their superiors that they are hurt because they're afraid to. That would make complete sense. It goes on to say, one study suggests that the Bureau of Labor Statistics data on workplace injuries, which is based on employer reports to the OSHA, missed between 33% and 69% of all workplace injuries in 2009, and that undercounting is likely an ongoing problem. So it's probably safe to assume that these stats are a really low end of the spectrum estimate, and we can assume that they are actually a lot worse than that. Yeah, so it says that injuries are often omitted, whether accidentally or intentionally, by employers. And I'm going to go ahead and say accidentally should probably be put in quotations, because they doing that shit on purpose. And it says, this survey found that 60% of the participants believed workers were scared or reluctant to report injuries, and that 78% of the respondents attributed this reluctance to fear of being fired. And, at this point, I think I'm getting repetitive. I think we get the point. So now I'm just going to look at the Safety and Health Guide for the Meatpacking Industry of the United States Department of Labor to just get some more not very fun facts. So toxic substances. Let's see what they have to say about that. Workers are often exposed to ammonia. Ammonia is a gas with a characteristic pungent odor and is used as a refrigerant and occasionally as a cleaning compound. Leaks can occur in the refrigeration pipes carrying ammonia to coolers. Mild to moderate exposure to the gas can produce headaches, salivation, burning of the throat, perspiration, nausea, and vomiting. Irritation from ammonia gas to the eyes and nose may be sufficiently intense to compel workers to leave the area. If escape is not possible, there may be severe irritation of the respiratory tract with the production of cough, pulmonary edema, or respiratory arrest. Bronchitis or pneumonia may follow a severe exposure. And sometimes things like bronchitis and pneumonia can be deadly based on if you have sometimes pre-existing conditions. So that's not fucking good. They also mention that there is sometimes exposure to unsafe levels of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and polyvinyl chloride PVC food wrap film. It mentions possible infectious diseases that they can be susceptible to, such as, and I don't know what some of these are, but brucellosis, erysipeloid, leptospirosis, dermatophytosis, and warts. So I think we can all agree that having a limb amputated or getting a serious illness or injury is not a good thing, but this next part I find very moving, and that's the psychological effects of being a slaughter worker. Despite people with carnist brainwashing trying to say that humans are apex predators, we actually get fucked up when we're killing all day because we're not really meant to kill all day. It messes with our psyche. It makes us depressed and anxious and violent and all of these things. Human nature tends usually more towards compassion. If you put an apple in a baby's crib and a chicken in a baby's crib, which one do you think the baby's gonna eat and which one do you think the baby's gonna play with? You know what I mean? We don't have claws, we don't have teeth, we can't even run fast enough to chase a squirrel. So, I don't know. All I'm trying to say here is that lions don't have to go to therapy for killing their prey. They just kill their prey because that's what they do to survive, and they do it with their claws and teeth, and they don't feel bad about it, and they don't have harmful effects on their psyche. I know that they're animals and not humans, and so they have a different capacity to be affected in that way, but hopefully you can get my point. So I'm looking now at an article by the Yale Global Health Review. It's a call to action, psychological harm in slaughterhouse workers, and it's from 2016. And it starts out like this. Down in the blood pit, they say that the smell of blood makes you aggressive. And it does. You get an attitude that if that hog kicks at me, I'm going to get even. You're already going to kill the hog, but that's not enough. It has to suffer. When you get a live one, you think, oh good, I'm going to beat this sucker. These words do not come from the mouth of someone that society would classify as mentally well. However, they are words that sadly represent a class of workers present in civilized countries across the world, slaughterhouse workers. And it's so true in any other context, like if they were killing dogs or if they were killing humans, this would be considered as a psychopath or a sociopath or a serial killer, and we would look down upon it. But since they're killing cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, etc., and they're doing it for people's taste pleasure, it somehow gets this free pass. It's just kind of weird. Okay, so this is an interesting quote that I definitely want to include in here, because a lot of times when vegans talk to people about humane slaughter, they'll mention the bolt gun to the head makes them unconscious, they don't know what's going on. But what a lot of them don't realize, because maybe they haven't watched Dominion or they haven't seen any footage, is that these bolt guns don't often work, and I would say don't usually work the first time, especially on larger animals like cattle. I've seen so many videos where they had to be shot or bolted in the head several times, and even after that, they're still walking and fully conscious and still get their throat slit while they're fully conscious. So, people telling themselves, oh, it's just a quick bolt to the head, they don't even know what's going on, it might be well-intentioned, and I used to say and think this myself before I was vegan, oh, it's just so quick, they don't know what's going on, they don't see it's coming, and then it's just boom, dark. But that's not the case, and here again is a non-vegan source proving that to not be true. And I quote, "Theoretically, all non-poultry livestock must be stunned before being bled out, generally with a contained bolt gun or knocker, or by a large electrical shock. In many operations, however, this is rarely achieved. Foremen often tinker with the settings on knockers and electric shotguns in order to protect the quality of the meat and set line speeds to be excessively fast, leading to conscious, active animals often flying down the line towards stickers." And stickers would be a type of worker. "The stickers then face the danger of being struck by the large, terrified animals. Making this more perilous and thus more stressful is the fact that the stickers hold sharp knives for the purpose of sticking the animals. These knives, when combined with the kicking animals, put stickers at risk of injuries ranging from cosmetic to gruesomely fatal." So a study was done to see what a slaughterhouse might do to crime rates in an area, and they used the FBI as well as the U.S. Census to come to a conclusion, and I'm going to read this quote. "Though the industries they used for comparison were nearly identical in other predictors of changes in crime, namely worker demographics, potential to create social disorganization, and effect on employment in the surrounding areas, slaughterhouses outstripped all others in the effect they had on crime. They not only led to a larger increase in overall crime, but disturbingly disproportionate increases in violent crime and sexual crime." So this is really interesting in a disturbing way, but they're talking about how killing animals all day makes you more likely to be violent towards humans, right? So here's a quote from one of the workers. "I've had ideas of hanging my foreman upside down on the line and sticking him. I remember going into the office and telling the personnel man I have no problem pulling the trigger on a person. If you get in my face, I'll blow you away." And it goes on to say, social theorists would consider this behavior to be a progression from animal abuse to human violence. However, this progression is distinct from the typical progression discussed in sociological and psychological literature. Most of the relevant literature addresses animal abuse preceding homicide or domestic abuse cases where the mental predisposition to abuse already exists and the animals serve as a convenient outlet for aggression and a relatively easy first step before moving to human targets. In slaughterhouses, the predisposition to abuse is not necessarily pre-existing, but killing animals may serve a similar purpose in those without a predisposition as it does in those with one by acting as a first step that desensitizes workers to further violence aimed at humans. So, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what this is saying is that if you go and be a slaughter worker, even if you didn't have this urge to hurt animals before, you can develop it through doing it as a job, and then you can also develop the urge to hurt humans from that, instead of serial killers who are a whole common thing about serial killers is that a lot of them harmed animals like small squirrels and rabbits and stuff when they were kids. But even if you weren't born like that, you could kind of become like that through slaughter work. That's what I think this is saying. Okay, so this is a phenomenon that gets really interesting. So it says, psychologically speaking, this desensitization may also be explained through the mechanism of doubling, in which individuals are compelled to create dual selves, one good and one bad. This coping mechanism is often necessary to deal with the morally dubious employment. Doubling has most notably been studied in the case of Nazi doctors, a situation which may be comparable to the institutionalized and necessarily unempathetic killing of animals in slaughterhouses. Creating and sustaining oneself with, quote, good moral character and having another self that can mechanically end lives for hours each day not only serves as another source of psychological stress for workers, but exposes workers to the risk that their pathologically unempathetic work selves will slip into their community lives. So basically what they're saying is killing animals all day is so damaging to us that we'll create a split personality and have this other personality that can do that without being affected by it. And that's just really sad. And again, not something that an actual apex predator would have to do. And then they're saying that self might come out outside of the work, which is really scary. So we all have heard of PTSD, but through this research, I learned a new thing called PITS. So it says, a combination of these mental acrobatics and stressors contributes to psychological disorder and specifically may create a type of post-traumatic stress disorder called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, PITS. Unlike many forms of traumatic stress disorders in which sufferers have been victims in a traumatic situation, sufferers of PITS are the casual participant in a traumatic situation. In other words, they are the direct reason for another being's trauma. Living with the knowledge of their actions causes symptoms similar to those of individuals who are recipients of trauma, substance abuse, anxiety issues, depression, and disassociation from reality. Once again, studies of this psychological phenomenon have largely ignored the slaughterhouse worker community, but they have addressed the issue in analogous populations, primarily Nazis and executioners. Without resorting to formal study, however, it is still possible to see that symptoms and causes of PITS fit neatly with slaughterhouses workers' testimonies. Okay, so it goes on to say more testimonies. That's insane, though. They're comparing, the psychological effects that slaughterhouse workers are going through to what Nazis were going through. And I know that they did this experiment about this, and there was, this movie about it that I watched where it was, they were taking these people in, and they were having them press, this shock button to shock, a person on the other side of the glass. And they were testing, this phenomenon where people, when they're being told aggressively to press the button, even though they see like the human in front of them suffering because of it, they'll still do it just to listen. Does that make sense? Maybe if I remember that movie or that phenomenon, I'll link it. But it's basically this phenomenon in the human psyche where when you're being pushed and told by a superior to inflict pain on another, either human or animal, even if you feel bad and even if you know it's wrong, you'll still do it. It's this weird thing. And like, I know I can relate to this because I used to ride horses, and like, my natural self is compassionate. I didn't want to use spurs and whips and all of that. And I had people around me like telling me and bullying me into doing that. And I went against my own natural compassion to kind of listen to them. And so I think it's a similar thing going on. Like, I think a lot of these Nazis, they knew what they were doing is wrong, but they're kind of doing what they're told because they're being like controlled and screamed at by, these higher up people. It's, this hurts my mind to even think or talk about it. It's crazy. It's crazy. And if you're still paying for animal products, you're paying for average everyday people to do this for hours every day. Like, come on. So here are the couple of testimonies they include. Quote, and then it gets to a point where you're at a daydream stage where you can think about everything else and still do your job. You become emotionally dead. And another quote. So a lot of guys at Morel, which is a major slaughterhouse, just drink and drug their problems away. Some of them end up abusing their spouses because they can't get rid of the feelings. They leave work with this attitude and they go down to the bar to forget. And it goes on to say, these stories echo those of combat veterans and survivors of disasters who suffer from stress disorders. The need to disassociate from reality to continue with their work leads to individuals down a path that some may term pathological. And once again, this is not vegan propaganda. This is not coming from a vegan resource at all, because it goes on to then say, currently, slaughterhouse work is still a necessary evil in American society. No, the fuck it's not. It is not necessary in any capacity. How are you going to talk about these horrible things that are happening and then be like, well, it's necessary though, so like, oh well. Like, no. Fuck this. This seems to not exist anymore in our society. Alright, so now I'm looking at an article titled, Slaughterhouse Workers Are More Likely to Be Violent, Study Shows. And it's from 2013. So it says, people who work in abattoirs, which is like a word for slaughterhouses that other parts of the world use, are more likely to be desensitized to suffering, which in turn can make them more likely to be violent towards humans. The research published in the Society and Animals journal found. Overseas research has found that towns with abattoirs have higher rates of domestic violence and violent crimes, including murder and rape. And again, this is not a vegan article or resource at all, because it says the study showed that farmers are pretty nice. They take care of their animals. They're not laid back and all aggressive. But the meat workers, on the other hand, they're not so positive. So, of course we know that's not true. There's a lot of footage coming out all the time that shows farmers being abusive towards their animals. So, I don't even know why they bothered to say that. But just, again, I just want to emphasize that all of these sources I'm using are not vegan sources. So they say, a 2010 study by Canadian criminologist Amy Fitzgerald found violent crimes, including sexual assault and rape, increase in towns once an abattoir or slaughterhouse moves in. Alright, so now I've jumped to an article called PTSD in the Slaughterhouse from the Texas Observer, and this article is from 2012. And here's a quote from a slaughter worker. You may look a hog in the eye that's walking around in the blood pit with you and think, God, that really isn't a bad-looking animal. You may want to pet it. Pigs down on the kill floor have come up to nuzzle me like a puppy. 2 minutes later, I had to kill them. I can't care. So I'm trying to find more research about the PTSD or PITS that slaughter workers go through, and I'm not finding a whole bunch, but I did find myself literally just on the Wikipedia page real quick for PITS, which is also they're calling perpetrator trauma. And so they say perpetrator trauma, also known as perpetration or participation-induced traumatic stress, both abbreviated PITS, occurs when the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder are caused by an act or acts of killing or similar horrific violence. So it's basically the PTSD that you get from killing. So it also says that perpetrator trauma has been documented among the perpetrators of the Holocaust, the Indonesian communist purges, the Cambodian genocide, the South African apartheid, and among slaughterhouse workers. Can we just think about that for a moment? That slaughterhouse workers are being grouped with all of these other terrible things. That's fucking crazy. So apparently in 2010, the Human Rights Watch did describe slaughterhouse line work in the United States as a human rights crime. So I was able to find out what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about the experiment they did, and it's on like a documentary or a movie where they have these people pressing these buttons to shock the other people that I mentioned earlier. Well, I found out what it's called, and it's called the Milgram experiment, and it's the experiment on obedience to authority figures with a series of social psychology experiments conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram. I'm going to play a short clip from the YouTube video called Why Do We Obey Authority? The Milgram Experiments by Freedom in Thought.
Probably don't believe you're capable of doing. These are the acts that we call evil. Like many people, you might think that evil emerges out of a psychopathic or sadistical nature, but unfortunately, this just isn't so. The world witnessed such acts during World War II and, more specifically, the Holocaust. When Adolf Eichmann, one of the main figures responsible for organizing the systematic killing of millions, was put on trial, he said that he was just following orders. This thought is frightening. This is the kind of statement that makes you rethink the idea of evil. It transforms evil from being the work of a small minority to a product of the vast majority. Perhaps evil is what happens when people stop thinking for themselves and just obey the orders of others. If so, the capacity for evil lies within all of us. This is the context in which Stanley Milgram conducted his renowned experiments on obedience.
So this is honestly chilling to me, because when you think about the evil that is done to animals in animal agriculture, it is the vast majority of people that is responsible for it, not a small minority. It's the majority of people that are paying for these things. And as he said in the video, it's a result of just not thinking and following orders or following the norm. And that's what we're doing as a society when we don't think about things. And then we literally pay people who are carrying out things similar to what the Nazis did, except instead of being done on humans, it's done on animals. And that's not to say that, you know, a holocaust of humans and a holocaust of animals are on an equal moral plane, but, you know, they are the same thing. It's just one has humans and one has animals. So I'm going to play more from this video about the Milgram experiments, and as you listen to this, I want you to think about it in the context of slaughter workers working in the slaughterhouse and having their bosses telling them to keep going, as well as the consumers who are not thinking, demanding them to keep going, acting in direct contradiction with their morals when they're against animal cruelty. It's very interesting.
Chilling experiment that reminds us that with the ability for great good comes the ability for great evil. To really understand the Milgram experiments, it helps to split it up into two tests, the fake one and the real one. Let's start with the fake one. There are 3 participants, the experimenter, a teacher, and a learner. The subject that Milgram was studying was always given the role of teacher. The learner was an actor that was in on the experiment. The actual study was disguised as a fake study that was said to be testing the effects of punishment on learning. Specifically, they were testing the effects of administering electric shocks on a learner's ability to memorize a list of word pairs. For example, green flower or couch potato. The subject was tasked with teaching the learner this list. The subject would go through the list once and then read off one of the words in a pair. If the learner guessed the word correctly, the subject would move on to the next pair. But if they guessed incorrectly, the subject was supposed to administer an electric shock. Shocks went up in 15-volt increments all the way up until 450 volts. There were also corresponding labels indicating the intensity of shocks, ranging from slight shock to simply XXX. The real test underlying this fake one was to see how far subjects would be willing to go in administering shocks before they stopped. At the shock level of 300 volts, the subject would hear the learner pounding on the wall and begin refusing to answer. A second pound was heard at 315 volts. This test was designed to put the subject in a tug-of-war between obeying their own morals and obeying an authority figure. If the subject began hesitating, the experimenter used one of 4 prods to get him to continue. They ranged in intensity from simple requests to orders. The results of the test were shocking. 65% of participants administered the maximum level of shocks. All participants obeyed until 300 volts. Various forms of Milgram's experiments have been replicated several times and continue to produce similar results.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy, isn't it? I know I had seen a documentary about these experiments and I never forgot about them. I strongly encourage you to do more research about it. It really makes you think, and it really makes you look at people in society, such as slaughterhouse workers, differently. As well as the way humanity, kind of as a survival instinct, will just so easily give up control to authority and just follow and obey orders without thinking for themselves. It's crazy. It truly is. So I want to look at one final resource before I close this, and that is the Economic Policy Institute, and I'm looking at this article, quite recent, from September 2020, called Who Are America's Meat and Poultry Workers? And it's focused on the demographics. So it starts out right away saying this. In September, the U.S. Department of Labor issued its first citation against 2 meatpacking plants for failing to protect employees from exposure to the coronavirus. At those plants alone, almost 1,500 workers have been infected and at least 12 have died, but the fines totaled just $29,000. Just goes to show how there's just no care given for these workers whatsoever. As well as no care for the animals, of course, and literally no care for humanity as we know it, as, these industries cause these pandemics in the first place. It goes on to say that one of the most dangerous and exploitative industries in the country, the slaughter and processing of the meat we eat, relies heavily upon rural workers, disproportionately immigrants, refugees, and people of color, who have few better options. According to the Food and Environment Reporting Network, or FERN, which has tracked the spread of the coronavirus in this industry since April, as of September 22nd, at least 42,708 people in 496 meat and poultry plants have been infected with COVID-19, and at least 203 have died. Are we surprised? Are we surprised that this is happening in the industry that creates pandemics? Are we surprised? So here's data to show the disproportionate worker demographics. So I'm looking at a chart that says characteristics of all U.S. workers and of animal slaughtering and processing workers in the U.S. On the left it says all U.S. workers, and on the right it says animal slaughtering and processing workers. So for all U.S. workers, there are 47% female, and the race percentages for all U.S. workers are 63.5% white, 11.3% black, 16.8% Latino or Latina, 5.9% Asian American or Pacific Islander, 0.5% American Indian, and 2% other. And then when we compare that, all U.S. workers, to just animal slaughtering and processing workers, we have only 34.5% white as compared to 63.5%. And then black goes up to 21.9%. And then Latino or Latina goes all the way up to 34.9%. And Asian increases to 6.8%. And then we have a small increase of American Indian to 0.7%, and then other is 1.3%. And so we have this is a big one here. So the percentage of foreign-born workers, of all U.S. workers is 17.1%. But when you look at just animal slaughtering and processing workers, foreign-born goes all the way up to 37.5%. And then when we look at all U.S. workers compared to just slaughter and meat workers, the percentages for whether they are citizens or non-citizens, in all workers we have 49.6% citizens and 50.4% non-citizens. But when we look at meat and slaughter workers, that 50% goes up to 70% non-citizens and only 29.1% citizens. So, documented versus undocumented. So that's for the whole country. And then they have some examples for certain places. Like here we are looking at Mississippi. In Mississippi, all Mississippi workers, the percentage of white is 60.2%, and the percentage of black is 34.6%. And when you take that and look at slaughterhouses and meat packing places, the white percentage goes down to 21.6%, and the black percentage goes all the way up to 67.6%. And of course the other races, but those were the two that I just wanted to highlight. And then for there, the citizenship status among foreign-born workers goes from 61% undocumented for all workers to 87% are undocumented when it comes to the meat and slaughter industries. So clearly very disproportionate when it comes to race or ethnicity and whether or not you are undocumented. Whew. Okay, if you can't tell in my voice, I'm getting pretty tired. I hope that you did make it through the end of this, because there was a lot of valuable information about human rights and the way that humans and certain groups of humans are exploited by the animal agriculture industries and the horrible ways in which slaughter workers are treated. And you have to remember that if you're buying animal products, you're paying for systemic racism. You're paying for human rights violations. It's not just about human rights. Like, this shit goes deep, and that's not even getting into the fact that these industries are causing pandemics and causing horrible diseases like heart disease and horrible things to people's health. So, it's just madness. I'm tired. Please go vegan. It's still January 2020. It is not too late to sign up for Veganuary. So, Google Veganuary, sign up for that shit. They make it so easy. As if you needed any more reasons to go vegan. If the animal suffering wasn't enough for your heart to stop being cold, hopefully the human suffering is. Alright, I gotta sign off now. I hope you have a beautiful day, and thank you so much for listening. Seriously, I really appreciate it, because I put a lot of work into this one, if you listen to the whole thing. Thank you, and do definitely share, because I think that this issue and this information needs to get out there as well. Alright, see ya. Bye.